he had told him that Herod had died, so that it was safe to go back. So Mary and Joseph were on their way back to Nazareth, probably on the road that will take them through Jerusalem. So, and it says in verse 21 that they arose. There was no questions asked, no argument or anything. They just went. Joseph, again, obeyed, and they were headed home. This time, they were headed home, so they were excited. They were wanting to get out of Dodge, as the saying goes. So, God had protected them, and now they could leave Israel. God didn't want his son brought up in Egypt because, like I said earlier, 1,500 years earlier, God had brought his people, the Israelites, out of slavery. So he didn't want his son, his precious son, to grow up in an environment such as that. So they're on their way back to Nazareth. Then Herod's son comes along, Archelaus, which rumor had it that he was even worse than his father Herod. You hear all this stuff that Herod did. It's like, how in the world could that be possible? That he was worse than his father? Well, there was a riot that broke out in Jerusalem. In order to stop that riot, he just had everybody in the crowd killed. Just like that. He didn't send the police in there at all to do crowd control. He just had them all killed. And also, Archelaus went into the temple on Passover, of all things, in the temple on Passover, and executed 3,000 Jews. He's following right into his father's footsteps right there by doing all those terrible things. But finally, Rome got tired of this, and they banished him to France, where he later on died. But as Mary and Joseph were traveling back to Judea in verse 22, where Archelaus ruled, they were afraid because they had heard about him, about how he was worse than his father. So being warned by God in a dream, they hurried up and headed north as fast as they could so they could get out of there and get back to Nazareth, which this also was a fulfillment of prophecy of the Old Testament in Isaiah, which says, "The shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse," which meaning that Jesus was from the line, the family, the relatives of Jesse and of David, which they were from this area. But Nazareth was such a small town. It wasn't even mentioned in the Old Testament. Nazareth was being famous for not being famous. That's basically sums Nazareth up there. And Nathanael in John 1:46 says, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Boy, was he ever wrong with that. Can you believe that? What good can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, I can tell you the greatest thing could ever come out of Nazareth, and that was Jesus Christ. There is something very special about insignificant little towns like Nazareth. Take Harrison, for example. God has placed each and every one of you in this town for something special. And that's what God did with his son Jesus. He sent him to an insignificant town that wasn't even mentioned in the Old Testament. God wanted his son to be raised outside of politics, outside of prosperity, outside of notoriety. He wanted his son to be raised in a simple village without fame or prestige. There were actually a lot of Gentiles in this area, and that's a great place for the Son of Man, the Son of God, to be raised in that environment, because there's Gentiles there to witness to, because they're not, if you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile, and so they weren't of the law at that time. So what better place for God to send his son to be raised up in, but in a place where they don't know any better. So what can we learn from all this? One, the first thing is the safest place to be is where God leads you. The wise men followed the star, which led them to Jesus. The wise men followed God's instructions, and they escaped Herod's wrath. Joseph had followed the angel's instructions in a dream and escaped to Egypt. And then Joseph followed God's instructions in a dream and escaped the wrath of Archelaus. So, the safest place you can be is in the center of God's will. Whatever path you take in life, God knows where you're going to head. But what better place than to follow God's path for you, to follow His will? Number two, what we can learn from this is Christians aren't exempt from troubles, as we saw from this. This first Christmas brought so many troubles and trials. The wise men avoiding the wrath of Herod. If somebody's on my back, I think I'm in a little bit of trouble with that. Also, Mary and Joseph fleeing to Egypt, fleeing for their life. And then all these multitudes of innocent babies being murdered. So this was just a baby, but not just any baby. This was God's son, God's precious boy. It would have been so much easier if God would have gotten rid of Herod. That would have just solved everything. But then, why doesn't God just get rid of Satan? But the answer to that is, He will. He will. After all, it was Satan who was behind all this